Good afternoon and welcome to this COMPAS webinar on COVID and the community. My name is Eric MacGilvray. I'm a professor of political science here at Ohio State University, and I'm the coordinator of this year's COMPAS series on COVID-19. As many of you know, COMPAS is a program of the Ohio State Center for Ethics and Human Values. COMPAS is an acronym that stands for Conversations on Morality, Politics, and Society. And the mission of the COMPAS program is to promote informed and civil discussion of important and controversial public issues. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic is one of the most important and controversial issues facing our nation and the world today. And today's panel is the second in our spring series of COMPAS events that explore the ethical and political dimensions of the pandemic and the response to it. The next panel will be 2 weeks from today on Friday, March 5th at this time and also on Zoom. The topic will be the global economy after COVID, and it will feature Elizabeth Reynolds from MIT's Work of the Future Initiative and Abe Newman from the Mortara Center for International Studies at Georgetown University, with moderation by my colleague, Ben McKean. More details about that panel and about the whole COVID COMPAS series, including videos of our previous events, are available at cehv.osu.edu/COMPAS. Today's panel, COVID in the Community, will be moderated by my colleague, Wendy Smooth. I'll let Wendy introduce our panelists, but first let me briefly introduce her. Wendy is Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies and Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the College of Arts and Sciences here at Ohio State. Her work focuses on women's experiences in political institutions and the impact of public policy on women's lives, which makes her an excellent moderator for this conversation. Wendy, take it away. Wendy, you're muted.
Thank you. In keeping with 2020, 2021. Thank you so much, Eric, for the introduction and for bringing together this most excellent panel and the work that you do through the Center for Ethics and Human Values that encourages us as the Ohio State University to engage in our motto of education for citizenship. Today, I have the honor of moderating a conversation with two incredible community leaders, David Brown of the Harmony Project, which is a nonprofit organization that's connecting everyday people around the big questions of culture and the big questions of how we live together in a complicated and complex society. We also have with us William Murdock, who's of the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission, a group of local government actors who are coming together to help us think critically about regional problems and issues. So as you see, we have two incredible voices with us today who can help us think about how we as everyday citizens, because I always like to remind people, whether we are coming together to sing and to perform across difference, or whether we are coming together in local government meetings, we are all everyday citizens who are trying to do our part to move the questions of our democracy forward through culture and through governance. And so what we want to do today is have a conversation across those spaces about how we're doing that in the midst of COVID-19. What I'd like to do, I've kind of given a truncated version of your organizations, but David and William, can you offer us a quick kind of synopsis of what your organizations do and what you've been up to during the COVID pandemic? I'll start with William.
Great, thanks,
Welcome.
Wendy, and pleasure to be here with you and David and everybody today to talk about this. So I work with the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission. Folks just call us MORPC, and that's our acronym. And we work with local governments all over Central Ohio on really key things to get them ready for the future, but also to deal with the present day crises. Things like transportation, sustainability, air quality. We look at systems and infrastructure, and we look at things like broadband and the data and the science that underlies all of that. We're nonpartisan. We work all across that spectrum, and we have 75 different local governments and a board of 150. From the rightest of the right to the leftist of the left to the bureaucrats, and I say that adoringly, in the middle. And for COVID, we've steered right into that role of, can we convene them on these things? Can we collaborate together? How can we move some of these things that we work on in the long term to address the short term? So it's been a busy time, like for everybody, and we've done a lot of that remotely. And Well, Wendy, that's what we've been up to. So looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you so much, William. David, can you share a little bit about the Harmony Project?
Sure. Thank you, Wendy, for having us here today. And I love that you started with everyday people, because now I've got Sly Stone in my head singing I am everyday people. That's a good song to have stuck in my head for the rest of the day.
That's a good one.
So Harmony Project is a nonprofit organization, as you said, that's kind of a combination of two ideas, and that is artistic passion, combining that with social purpose. So the idea was to find something that would unite people, the love of music, get them together, whether they had any experiences or backgrounds in that, because so many music programs are designed for people who can sing or who have musical talents and abilities, but yet all of us love to sing in the car or the shower. And so our idea is just bring all those voices together, and then the weaker voices get lifted by the stronger. And then when you give these people amazing artistic experiences, like backing up recently John Legend or singing at Nationwide Arena in front of 10,000 people, they earn their way to that stage by volunteering in the community. So 10 years ago when we started as a 100 voice choir, and now we have over about 1,100 people participating in music programs every week. About 17, I think, different schools participate with their kids. We're in transitional and supportive housing facilities, we're in prisons, and we work wherever music can go into and break down divisions and break down barriers and unite people. And you know, like most arts organizations, COVID hit us pretty hard, because everything we do is hand to hand, it's face to face, and that's the strength of what we do. So we went from literally our biggest concert we had ever done in December of 2019 to 3 months later not being able to even gather and sing, because singing had become a super spreader event. And so for the first month and a half, I think we were all in a bit of shock, and like, how do we continue? How do we go on? And that was a very real question. Would we even be able to go on? And so what we've done is just, you know, we decided to focus. Our artistic director, Barbara Fant, who is an amazing artist in this community, she just kept saying to me, don't focus on what we cannot do, focus on what we can do. And so that's basically what we did, is we've started having rehearsals online. This coming Monday, we're going to have almost 500 people on Zoom. So that's 20-something pages of faces, and they're all singing, they're all muted. And that's one of the benefits of COVID, is that I could just mute my entire choir right now when I don't want to hear them, which is kind of a nice thing. But they're all muted, but we sing along and they sing at home. And then we're all learning the music together and singing together at the same time. We keep our service projects going, we keep them safe and socially distanced, but there has been a rise in the number of people wanting to give back and wanting to do something, because everyone feels so isolated and so trapped. And then to our programs in the prisons, these folks were already extremely isolated, so we've made sure we keep going in there through Zoom to remind them that they're not alone. PCI, one of the institutions we work at one point had the second highest COVID population in the nation. And these folks are not able to get away from, you know, each other like we are able to separate in distance. So we found that it was important to focus on what we can do, reach out to those who are the most isolated, stay in touch, keep people singing, keep people serving, and keep looking to the future, because we know that one day, even if it looks a little different, we're going to be back together again. So we're just pushing forward to that day.
How inspiring. I think I needed to hear that message today in particular. I think I'm in my moment of COVID, which we all have had those moments. You know, one of the things that we've talked a lot about here in Central Ohio is this idea of we're all in this together, right? It's become our kind of Central Ohio popular refrain in response to the pandemic in the community. Yeah, one of the things that we know and we're feeling very acutely is not everyone is experiencing the pandemic the same way. Based on the experiences and the work that you're doing and the outreach and community spaces that you're touching, can you talk a little bit about how some of those differences have manifest, and then how those differences are telling us something about the needs of the broader community that maybe expand beyond COVID? David, do you want to start?
Oh, I was so hoping you would start with William, but sure.
I can do that if you like.
I'll jump in. And y'all have to wave me down because I'm a talker. You have to wave me down if I'm going too long now.
Okay.
So I guess I would say that, early on in the pandemic, I was on a call with a major funder who said, we're all in the same boat. And I said to him, I would be careful using that analogy. And I said, because the boat that you're in, it does have a hole in it. It is taking on water, but you have lifeboats and you have life preservers, and the water that you're in is shallow. And I said, and a lot of the people that I work with don't even have a boat. Mm-hmm. And so we're not in this together in a lot of ways. Yes, we're all living here. Yes, we're all going through this pandemic, but I don't think that COVID has changed any of the discrepancies and the inequities of our society. I think it's just held a giant magnifying glass up to them and has really shown us all, like you look at the difference between, and I'm just going to use these two schools as an example, and it's not a good or bad, it's just the reality. You look at 2.5 miles east of Parsons, you've got Bexley High School, where there's a hybrid model, Bexley schools, where the kids are going and they're able to still put on plays and musicals, and they're struggling too, and those kids are isolated as well. But then you look right down Parsons at South High School, and you look at a city school where these kids have been out of school for an entire year almost now, with no social and emotional connection. Parents that are stressed out of their minds on how they're going to pay the bills, choosing between whether or not they're going to have Wi-Fi at home or have electricity at home. And then you've got to get the computers to the kids. You've got to hope that they will get up and be motivated to learn. And I don't know about you two, but if my parents had not pulled that cover off of me when I was 16 years old and flipped the light on and said, get your butt out of bed, I don't know if I would have gotten up and gone to school online every day. So we can't blame these kids. They're lost. School provides structure. So there's even discrepancies in the kids. And then what I mentioned with the prisons. I don't think that people realize that when you shut off all outside access to programming, to visitors, to families, to people being able to come in, these men and women who are already extremely isolated are living in an extreme isolation where they only see each other. And then their fear increases and their distrust increases, and the progress that has been made with so many of these folks in their therapeutic care communities, it recedes and they pull back because there's not that daily, influx of positivity, of hope, of encouragement, of art, of expression that is a crucial part of rehabilitation. So I guess I would say that it's everything that I've seen is that it's just increased our awareness of it. And it's made us kind of, I think, in some ways, look at the fact that we have this moment to address this. And if we go forward and we don't address it, we're just going to be back to where we were before. So let's not waste this crisis that we've been in. Let's acknowledge what it's brought us to and how it brought us to our knees. And if we all want to be able to stand together this time, we're going to have to reach out and grab each other to stand up at the same time, because it hasn't affected us all the same way. But for us to move forward as a society, we do have to respond to it in the same way.
So
thank you.
Here's what.
Yes, William.
So here's what gives me hope. And David, I agree with you so much on that. But here's what gives me hope. In our role, and to steal David's phrase earlier, we bring the voices together around the region. So we have small town mayors, we have rural folks, we have big city mayors and county commissioners, township trustees, village mayors. And in the pandemic, what I've seen them do is what you might not think is happening if you're just watching the federal or the state level. And those folks, they have their eye on squarely on the ground on what people are going through. They've been innovating, they've been trying to help, they've been rolling up their sleeves. And part of what we've been doing is we've been convening them as much as we can. So bring them all together and just try to level set on information, share ideas. And in a time like this, when we say we're all in it together, I know that kind of becomes cliche. But what I've seen with a lot of our local government officials and leaders is they're taking it seriously, because you know what, they too are feeling that isolation, where we've never faced this. How do we do this? And they're really leaning on each other and leaning on community leaders to make a big difference. Here's what gives me concern. And when David started to get to it, but all of the problems we're seeing in the pandemic existed before the pandemic. And what the pandemic has done is put this giant spotlight on it. And so like David was saying, we're really concerned about accessibility to things like internet and computers and housing and transportation. And so many people in this time period have the luxury, the privilege of being able to work from home because they have internet and a job that allows it and a computer at home. So many folks in our community don't. And that has made this so much harder for them to access employment, to access school, to access each other. We see that in housing too, where people who've got the means have really heated up the housing market. But in the Columbus area, we actually have some really big gaps in equity and affordability in the housing market, and the pandemic's made it worse. And kind of looking forward, that's what we're really focused on, is how can we take advantage of this spotlight and really keep we're all in this together attitude as we're coming out of this, to really turn our resources and to turn our attention to some of these big issues in our community.
Thank you so much, William. I want to remind the audience, or say to the audience, we have the Q&A section available, and we want you to post your questions. I'm going to ask a few more questions, but as we are talking, if things come to mind and things you'd like to contribute and think about, we'd really like you to post those in the Q&A, and we will get to your questions as well. William, you left us with a really important point, and I am, in addition to being a faculty member in women's gender and sexuality studies, I also have a degree in political science and teach and work in that field as well. And my area in particular is state and local government. So I'm always teaching students that our local government context, those are our community friends. They are our neighbors. We have close access to them, and they're really our kind of front line in terms of thinking about governance. And like you said, everything from transportation to sustainability. So I want to ask you this question about kind of where we are in the COVID pandemic. You know, we come down in many different perspectives about kind of the role of government in our lives, right? Some see a more restricted role for government, some see a more expansive role for governments. Can you talk a little bit about how your organization is thinking through the role of government in the pandemic? And if you see any greater openings that people are interested in government playing a broader role or less of a role in some of the issues that are impacting the pandemic. So what role is government, and especially our local governments, playing in how we're approaching the pandemic?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And oh boy, do I feel strongly about this one. So, and we're just going to talk about local government.
Yes.
They have really dove into how to deal with this crisis and how to innovate and talk to each other. But what we're seeing is really clearly, more than we've seen before, is that our communities, people in our communities, everyday people, they don't like uncertainty and they don't like change. And right now it's happening all over the place all the time. And as folks in local government, sometimes that makes them more able to respond to the crisis, because you don't go into local government for fame and glory. You go into it because you want your neighborhood to be better, your community to be better. And so sometimes that's helpful because you can respond really quickly. But what we've seen too is there's just been so much information, and the science has been developing really quickly, and that causes people uncertainty. The economic situation has been up and down for a lot of folks, and that causes frustration. And there's so much change. Just what do you do with your kids, and what do you do with your workplace? And that's kind of overwhelming to all of us. But if you're a community leader, that really makes you think about this role and, okay, who are our partners? And what we've seen is when the role of local government, maybe more than ever, really depends on nonprofit leaders, depends on community leaders, depends on businesses, and all of that depends on communication. And I think the lesson here coming out of it is local government in particular is going to have to adapt to help people get in front of uncertainty, to help them deal with change, and to recognize they can't do it all. And the responsibility to those of us in the community, to those of us who are businesses, that is to recognize that, take a deep breath and say, hey, how can we help? And I really think that spirit of partnership is going to be so necessary as we're coming out of this.
Right. You know, one of the areas, David, you kind of alluded to this in your early remarks, is how hard hit the arts have been. Right. And also, you know, we think about this from even a government perspective. We've often relied on the resources from our local and state governments to help supplement the arts. Could you talk a little bit about kind of the importance of the arts in a moment like this, to tell the story, to reflect the differences in the ways in which we're kind of experiencing the pandemic, and thinking about the role of the artist in helping to guide us through some aspects of the pandemic, in terms of how we're dealing with these feelings, this isolation, our mental health. And what can maybe we both could talk about what government can do to support those efforts.
Sure. Well, and to the point of what William was talking about with our local, local political leaders, local community leaders, the same can be said of our local arts leaders. You know, OAC, Ohio Arts Council, Greater Columbus Arts Council. You know, two organizations that have been hit, in very unique ways by this pandemic. And like you mentioned, the funding, the federal funding, state and local funding, but how they have stepped up in major ways to really support the individual artists, not just the organizations, but to realize that, you know, the bread and butter of the arts community is the individual artist, the individual performer, the gig workers, the people who paint something and hope to be able to sell it, you know, at a festival that's no longer going to happen. The individual singers who are out there writing music and wanting to teach in the classrooms, and to the government point, coming back into the arts point. While you were talking, I had another song pop into my head, and it was the Tina Turner song, you know, "We Don't Need Another Hero." I think that maybe what COVID has done is that, you know, it has said to the arts communities, we don't need to look beyond ourselves for somebody to make the change that we want to see. We have to figure out what our part is. We have to figure out how we can inject our voice, inject our opinion, inject our art to help with others. So the ways that I've seen artists respond, you know, you look at the downtown, you look what happened after the protests began and after George Floyd's murder. You look at what happened with the landscape of art that began to appear and the expression that began to appear. And if you never got a chance to see it, and a lot of it's gone now, but if you never got a chance to see it, you should go online and look it up, because there are some masterpieces that were created just on the streetscapes of downtown Columbus. And it wasn't just a tribute to this moment in time. It was the voice of that artist, you know, being projected up onto that canvas. I look at the 400 and something people that sit in front of a computer screen on Monday nights and they're muted, but they're singing along in their homes because there's something about the music that is drawing them into this moment that makes them feel connected and not so isolated and not so far apart from each other. I look at what happens in the prisons when we go in for 45 minutes and they forget where they are for 45 minutes because music or poetry or spoken word or creative arts help them reconnect with who they are, and that they remember that who they are is not defined by where they are, Just like in our community right now, the families who are struggling that that William was talking about, the great disparities that we have to remind everyone in our community that your economic condition does not define who you are, that your geographic location does not define who you are. Your voice defines who you are, and that's where the arts come in. We are the social and emotional connection that help people remember to continue to express themselves. And during COVID, I think when we've all been spending a lot of time with ourselves, maybe too much at times, I think there's a tendency to withdraw and to pull in and to go inward and be worried, as William was talking about change and uncertainty. And yet art allows us to escape for a little while. And it allows us to kind of get into something else and channel all that anxiety and channel all that fear and that potentially negative energy into something that's positive and creative that can, even if only momentarily, lift us from where we are and kind of raise us up to the next level. How the community can support artists, this is a really simple answer. Hire them. Hire artists. Hire somebody to sing and pay them to sing a song to somebody that you know who's in the hospital who could watch it on their phone. Hire somebody to write a poem that tells a story of your family. Hire somebody to come paint a mural in your living room or in your child's bedroom. There are ways to hire artists right and left, and don't ask artists to do things for free because they need to make money. And so when people ask me, how do we support local artists? I say, hire them. Hire them and pay them. That's the best way to support them. It might be boiling it all down to too simplistic of an answer, but I do think that that's the one way that we're able to really make a change and support our local arts community is by remembering that for them to survive, they have to have work, and that means we have to hire them.
Fantastic. William, yes.
Especially, and thank you for that, David, especially if I was a young person on the call or a student, this has been a period of maybe unprecedented isolation, anxiety, depression, and arts has been so critical to me and my family as we've been trying to navigate the last year, even doing it virtually. I know how important it has to be, especially if you're a young person. So thinking of local governments and how they can support it, just a quick anecdote. So we get these calls together of local government leaders, 70 mayors and things, and we're in the midst of the COVID pandemic and we're talking about health guidelines and penalties and how are we going to navigate all this last spring. And we had a serious discussion, just to let you know what our local government leaders are going through, about what do we do with these pop-up concerts and we had for a time pop-up circuses, people on unicycles going through neighborhoods just to bring color and life to a community. And I have to tell you, I'm sitting there with my Zoom on mute going, we're having a serious discussion about the legal permissiveness of unicycles and concerts during a pandemic. But the whole point here is, the whole point is they care so much about their community and they know arts has meaning and events have meaning. And in their very serious government way, they're like, we have to figure out a way to do this. We have to figure out a way to help the community really get excited and engaged. We had similar serious conversations about the 4th of July and summer activities. Again, how do we keep people safe? But how do we recognize the value and the meaning of arts and togetherness and community events? And I think we had to all get creative over the last year. And maybe to add on to David's point about hiring artists, our local government leaders are working on making it easier for artists to do their thing and connect to the community, even in a pandemic.
So that's a wonderful way for us to think about kind of how we can continue to support, the arts. One of the things is we're talking and we're thinking about how people have experienced the pandemic quite differently. One of the things that I've kind of worried about is two things. On the one hand, I have a sense that this pandemic has, at least for a moment, built some connections around empathy and around how people can understand the experiences of others. I wonder if you might be able to talk a little bit more about how your organizations are building on this kind of moment of empathy. And in particular, for those who feel a little bit more left behind as we're moving through kind of the recovery component of the pandemic. This is my glass half full approach, that we're moving towards the recovery, but still feel left behind, right? Or frustrated by the depth of the disparities that they've experienced across the pandemic. How can we, on the one hand, make sure we're building on empathy, and then on the other hand, help people keep faith in community as a resource to meet their needs? William, you want to start us off? It's a lot in that.
I was hoping you'd pick David on that one. That's a tough question. You know, I think helping people understand that if we're all in this together, we have to have empathy. We have to have understanding of what others just down the street, around the corner are going through. And one thing we've been trying to do is to use the platform we have to bring leaders together to elevate different stories and to elevate different efforts going on in the community. You know, just last week, we brought all our local government leaders together to talk about mental health and to talk about the issues that we're seeing in the community. We've done the same thing with lifting up stories of folks and how they navigate just getting to work in a pandemic, and you know, thinking of the time that it takes and the complexity of what do you do when you have to be at work during a pandemic and you have to take transit, and by the way, your kids are working or have to study remotely and there's no childcare, and just trying to tell that story to make sure that we're really thinking about, especially when we're sitting in front of our computers, especially when we're in our houses, we're taking time to listen to other people's stories and to really think about how this situation might be disproportionately impacting folks. And, you know, just continuing to build on that, to pause and, you know, be grateful for your own ability to do whatever it is comfortably, but to pause and to hear those stories of different circumstances and hardships in our community. It's really important to keep that spotlight on.
Yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, sharing your story with people is the number one way that you overcome the fear of what you don't know. I can look back at my career at times when I was hired somewhere and then people left that because they didn't want someone like me working with their children, and sitting down and talking to them and sitting down and getting to know them. Not that it was my job to explain, you know, my situation, but hearing my story helped them, and then me hearing their story helped me understand the fears. So I do think that there's a power in the storytelling. I also think that for me, sympathy is empathy without muscle. You know, sympathy is this kind of, it's a little bit more of a passive thing, and empathy is more of an active thing. Sympathy is acknowledging what's happening and what's going on in the world around us, and then empathy is going, all right, so I need to be in your shoes. I need to be able to help you figure out, and if I have anything to offer at all, then it's about offering it, and it's about maybe being a little bit uncomfortable, you know, at times in the directions, in the neighborhoods that we go into, with the conversations that we have, and that if we go to it with an open mind and an open heart, and we're willing to listen and we're willing to hear, then we start to figure out what those doors are that we need to open. I mean, I can look at people who've come out of prison, and the reentry process is very frightening. But if there is a welcoming community to embrace them when they come out, the odds of them going back to prison decrease dramatically. If they have a network, and what we can do right now in this time where we're all connecting this way, is that we can actually create more networks than maybe we would have if we were meeting in person, because in person we all say, I don't have time to do all that. But you know what? You can find time to sit in front of a computer on a Zoom call And this is a way for us to maybe start engaging in even a more safe way of exchanging our stories, because it is one-dimensional. We're not there reacting to each other in the real time. And it gives us a chance to turn the computer off and then really think, or actually go look up what we were just talking about to even learn even more. Because that's how we move forward. That's how we move forward as a community. We believe in harmony is by sharing each other's stories, by walking in each other's shoes, by working together and overcoming our differences, not diminishing or minimizing them, but setting them here as a foundation for us to build on.
You know, if I can just build on that. So we talk a lot with our team members and even our community members about benefit of the doubt, which I think is a different way to say empathy in some ways. And since so many of us are physically disconnected, we're constantly trying to remind each other, hey, give people a little space. Understand you don't know what's outside of this screen, and you might not understand their situation. You might understand the stress or the anxiety of this time, or a health condition, or maybe a loved one died, and to give people a little bit of space and a little bit of grace. And I think our community leaders are trying real hard to do that too, where there are real problems in our communities, and there are real frustrations about not understanding change, about the uncertainty, and everybody taking a deep breath saying, let's give that empathy. Let's understand there's real frustration, there are real feelings, there are real problems behind that. It's hard to do, but kind of like David said, you got to make time for it. We got to be intentional, and we also have to help each other be intentional about doing the same thing.
That's a really great segue, William, into one of the questions that we have from our audience. And I want to remind folks, please post questions in the chat. We want to make sure that our audience is as much a part of this great conversation as those of us who are kind of on the screen. Kathy Johnson asked us to think about an example of something that has happened, say, in the past 6 months that shows our communities are indeed working toward something of a better future. So anything or examples that you might be able to share with us of how we're seeing communities come together and work towards this kind of better imagined future. William, you want to kick us off?
Sure, why not? So one of the things we work on that maybe you don't expect is trails. And so we work on bike trails, we work on connectivity, we work on giving people those options. And one of the things that we know about Central Ohio, we know we don't have oceans, we don't have mountains, but we have really lovely nature corridors and really lovely streams. And where we've invested our public infrastructure to do that is in neighborhoods that tend to be wealthier and tend to be whiter and less diverse. And what we've done unintentionally, hopefully as a community, is we've left out this wonderful experience for exercise or mental health or fresh air out for so many who might really benefit from it or might really want that opportunity. And so during the pandemic, we've really been focused on, we've got a whole group of community leaders who really focused on trails, saying, all right, we got to build connections to neighborhoods. We got to work to give people the opportunity to understand the systems there, to connect to it, to really think about those as a tool for building equity and building access, and building opportunities for families differently. And that's a little different than the past, where it's like, let's build the trail where the most people are going to use it. We have community leaders who've really flipped it on their head, saying, if we do this differently, if we do it right, we're going to bring a lot more people with us, and we can really, really make the whole community better and make those connections. And that's just one example that came to mind.
William, am I hearing that we may be seeing new trail systems emerge out of the pandemic that are more kind of urban centered?
Absolutely. So if you know Columbus, our rivers flow north and south, but it's really hard to get between them. And that's what we're focused on right now with folks like City of Columbus and Metro Parks, is how do we build those across urban neighborhoods to make it safe? Painting a little bike sign on a road and thinking you're going to feel safe, not going to cut it. You want a bike trail that's going to be comfortable for an 80-year-old grandma and her 8-year-old granddaughter. so that they can ride their bikes and be comfortable. And those are the kind of things that we've been talking about is, can we build those connections, especially the east-west ones? So yeah, absolutely.
Oh, very exciting, very exciting to hear. David, what do you, could you point us to that's, something concrete that's happened in the last, say, 6 months or so that really gives us this idea that we are working together to move towards a brighter, better future?
Well, I mean, in the world that I'm in, I'm seeing it everywhere. I'm seeing a much more intentional approach to diversity and inclusion. I'm seeing a much more intentional approach to social justice issues. I'm seeing a much more intentional, mindset of people looking at the systems of incarceration and the socioeconomic situations in our communities. I think that, forcing people to be at home and forcing people to kind of live in this world, of this kind of like all media all the time world, that so many people who got in their car every day and went a certain way to go to the office and worked in that office and then shopped in their neighborhoods. And it's really easy to live in the bubbles that we have. And as somebody who's lived in a few other larger cities, I always talk about Columbus as there's this giant bubble kind of over kind of Clintonville to German Village and like Eastmore to kind of like the hilltop. And then you kind of start to have that next bubble and then the next bubble. And I think that what's happened is that those bubbles have kind of burst a little bit because we've all had to realize we've all realized that we are far more connected than we thought we were in our community. And these programs online and the commitments that I'm seeing are making that possible. I mean, I look at corporations that are, you could argue that maybe it should have been done before, but the reality is it's being done now. And so like a commitment to diversity and inclusion officers, a commitment to understanding systemic racism in our culture, the books, the films, the resources that are coming out, that everybody feels like we need to be able to be fighting this cause together, which I feel like before the pandemic, there are organizations who were doing that. And then there were organizations that were supposed to do what we were doing. And now I think that there's a much greater awareness that we're all supposed to be a part of that conversation, not just leaving it up to somebody else to toe the line.
Sure. So what I hear you saying in that conversation, which is also, kind of an undercurrent of the COVID pandemic or kind of twin pandemic or double pandemic is one of the phrases I've used often, is really understanding that a lot of the disparities that we're seeing in terms of how people are experiencing the pandemic are disparities that are marked by historic racism in the US. And that's been a question that we've also had to think about how we're dealing with it, how we are addressing it, because as much as we're thinking about the economic challenges that are coming out of COVID, we also are seeing these things as intertwined and interconnected. And one of the things I'll say that I've been most encouraged by is the opportunity that the pandemic has presented for us to have a more direct conversation, and in these Hollywood squares online, in other spaces, to really think about how the pandemic is also illuminating more and making us claim more knowledge about the racial disparities that also exist in our community. I'm going to go to another question because I think it's a really interesting question that one of these statements and I'm going to put it into a little bit of a question. One of our other audience members talks about the loss of income that people have experienced through the pandemic. They reference a friend who was a teacher and professional musician experiencing a drop in their family's income by not being able to perform. But we also can see other sectors of the economy where people have had more of a direct hit and around their kind of personal finances and personal economy. William, I want to ask you, because you're in touch with our kind of local government officials, how is that issue showing up among our local governments in terms of how we might move towards recovery? How are we going to address some of those economic hits that families have experienced?
It's a great question, and it's one that's top of mind for a lot of our leaders. Housing is something a lot of folks are focused on with the affordability, and in this crisis, we've been fortunate in some ways because there's been things like eviction moratoriums as people are encountering loss of jobs or loss of income. Those are eventually going to come off. And all through the pandemic, we've seen house prices continue to soar, and the housing market for those who can afford it is really, really hot. And housing that's still being built is not affordable. It's not attainable for so many people. And so as we're thinking about coming out of this, we have leaders looking at things like rental assistance in new ways. We have them looking at, can we tighten up the regulations to make it easier to build housing, to help encourage housing to be built across the region? How can we look at ways to keep people in their homes? You know, my agency, we actually have an in-home program where we work with vulnerable families just to weatherize, improve their furnace, fix the hole in the roof. We're seeing more demand for that than ever. And so as we're coming out of it, there's a lot of attention to, if we're going to be the kind of community we want to be, we got to be there for that part of our community. We got to be there to help them navigate this time through it, because it could be worse. And maybe just one last thing. So we're planners at MORPC, and one of the extra burdens we have in Central Ohio is we have a growing community, and a lot of it's doing pretty well. But in communities across the country that are like us, that are growing and doing well, we also tend to have the worst economic and racial segregation. And the pandemic's made that worse. And when you overlay that with the stuff they talk about at the Kirwan Institute, and Jason Reese and that, with historical examples of redlining and those other things, we kind of have this double whammy where if we don't pay attention to this now, these problems are going to be so much worse. And it's something we just have to be having a sense of urgency about.
Wonderful. I do want to encourage people to still post questions in the chat and see if we can get a couple of more questions in the chat. One of the things that another question reminds me of is about kind of care. So, you know, we have a one post that talks about a family's experience with childbirth and not being able, in the sense of the pandemic, to be able to be present and be accountable and comforting and all of those things. And I say that that is a really great kind of microcosm for us to think about kind of our community overall, and in terms of being able to perform on our care and our wanting to be present for each other. Might you all talk about, David, might you talk about the way that the Harmony Project is attempting to be present in the community, both in COVID and beyond COVID, to really show the care? And I'm particularly drawn to what you said, that as the Harmony Project community has grown, you're requiring something of people to be a part of that community, is to give and give back. Can you talk a little bit about how that's influencing the Harmony Project and how we show up?
Yeah, so first, there's never any cost for someone to participate in any of our programs, but there is a requirement, and that requirement is service, and it's based on a certain number of hours per season, and we have 2 seasons a year. So in 2019, we were generating roughly around 65,000 hours of volunteer, commitment a year, which is pretty remarkable, because there are people that want to be connected. So what COVID did was, throw the brakes on that at first and made us have to go, well, how do we bring people together? Because in our minds, service had always been a whole bunch of people coming together and creating tremendous impact, like showing up at Sullivan Gardens Recreation Center and painting a mural, or putting a soccer field together, or painting a gymnasium. And those things we could not do anymore. So we started thinking about this issue of isolation. And because we work in a lot of supportive housing communities, we thought about the residents that we know who are there, who are already isolated to a degree, and this has increased that. And so we started a letter writing campaign so that people could write letters. Now, we received the letters first because we want to make sure everybody, because this is still America, and we wanted to make sure that everybody's being treating each other with dignity and respect. But we had over 1,800 letters come in a week for people who just wanted to connect with other people in the community and wanted to remind them that they were not alone. And then we had the men at PCI recorded Christmas carols for children who were hospitalized at Nationwide Children's Hospital. We have the women at ORW singing to children in South Africa that's been hit very hard by COVID and by the South African variant, which we're now hearing about in our country, singing to children in hospice care across the world and using their voices that way. It's painful. Just last week, our community lost a really wonderful woman, Missy Weiler, who passed away. Bob and Missy Weiler are stalwarts in this community, and nobody could go. You can't go and hug and be there and cry and celebrate together, but you find ways to send messages and to reach out and connect. So we have created service opportunities where people can just, rather than get out of their cars and have the risk, everything becomes, you drive up, we're masked and gloved, we open your trunk, we take your donations out, we put them into another truck that gets delivered to where it's going. And in the past, those events would have been well attended and would have received an enormous amount of donations. But during COVID, those numbers have skyrocketed in the amount of donations that are coming in. Because number one, people are wanting to connect. And even if their connection is only driving up in a car and waving through the windshield and popping the trunk so that you can take something out of it and deliver it, they know it's getting to where it needs to go. So I'm not painting a rosy picture. It's not, we're all depressed and we all really want to be back in person again. Yeah. But we're finding the way that we can still bring connection and connectivity, and we can still have people show up and work in a community garden if they're spread far enough apart from each other. And we can still have people show up and add a mural to a school if they're far enough from each other and if the shifts are far apart. So just like in the beginning of the pandemic, we weren't supposed to wear masks, and now we are. What we've learned along the way is that we are adapting to, and that we're learning new ways to do things. And I think, I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I know for us, I think when Harmony Project returns to normal, that it's probably going to be a hybrid of what we've been doing and what we were doing. And I think that is a new landscape that everybody's going to be able to kind of embrace, because it won't be forced on us at that point. It'll be an option, and Americans love options.
You hit it. You guys, it was right on like one of the final questions I want to ask of you guys, in the sense of, what have we learned? Ohio State, we are a learning community. That's our enterprise. That's what we do. We encourage our students to always think about how they are learning more about how to be good citizens, how to act as citizens. What have we learned in this pandemic? And what do you think is going to be like the lasting power of the pandemic in terms of the positives that we're going to take forward? That, again, to that question earlier, that make us better as a community. William, what are you seeing that, lessons learned, that we're getting the lesson, you feel?
So this is a question that I am simultaneously excited about and stressed out about too. So what I mean by that is, in the last year, we've seen businesses, schools, local governments move really quickly. They've moved mountains to get people online, to solve community problems. It hasn't been perfect, but they've moved really quickly. They've marshaled a lot of resources, a lot of rules bent or invented to just make it possible to survive and to help our community through this over the last year. And I think as we're thinking about coming out of this, the things that we work on in the long term, building transit, trails, environmental problems, climate change, racism. If you're a young person or anybody who's really been paying attention, we've got no excuse to get hard things done. We've got no excuse not to move quickly and not to find the resources to solve these problems if we really want to. And like I said, that's really exciting, because you know what? These are problems that have vexed us for a long time. Let's go. We know we can move faster. We know the resources are there if there's a will to do that. And I think we're going to have our feet held to the fire, and I think that's a good thing.
David.
Well, like William, I feel actually a little bit more of the anxiety than the excitement about this mission. I guess I would say that, I want to preface it with this. I usually don't talk about what I've learned when I feel like I'm still in the learning part of the lesson, because I feel like this is 2020, the sequel. I know that the calendar changed, but right now it still feels kind of like a sequel to what we just went through. I would say from a professional standpoint, some of the things that we've learned are that we can do some of the things we were doing for less than we were doing them before. And we should not let a budget cut stop us from having programming. We just have to rethink how we do it. And we have to approach it from a different perspective. I think professionally, I've also learned that the value of the arts in our schools, in our prisons, in our supportive housing facilities, in our elderly adult communities has been probably grossly underestimated in what the connections are that bring. It's also economic in the community. I mean, I look at just what our little organization contributes to the local economy every year and how much that has been cut back, and why it's another reason why we want to get up and running again, so we can be supporting more of our local artists again. So those are some of the things I've learned from that. And then personally, 5 years ago now, 2 young men and I adopted each other as a family. And we just recently moved out of the downtown market because, as William was talking about, those prices just keep going up and up. And we moved to suburbia, and we're the only people like us here. Mixed race, single dad who's gay, 2 young Black sons. And, during the pandemic, there's a lot of people kind of looking out the windows because everybody's kind of at home all the time. And so I think one of the things that I've learned is that it's not our job to bring people along, but if we want people to come along, we do have to lead. And that's why I'm saying we don't need a hero. We don't need a mayor to necessarily step up and tell us how to do it. We just need to step into our own shoes and lead. And each of us can do that. And the pandemic has reminded me that I shouldn't just get caught up in all the craziness of like shows and rehearsals and this and that. I should think more about the interpersonal relationships of the people who participate in all of our programming, and how can we continue to connect the students at South High School with the women at Marysville Prison, with the differently abled adults at Commons at Buckingham, with the women at Ohio Reformatory, with senior adults living at the Wexner Heritage Village, that if we are all in this together, then let's get all in this together and let's figure out a way to make it work,
Yes. That is a wonderful, energized space for us to end on. I want to be respectful of everyone's time and to thank everyone for their participation, David and William, and to our audience members. We at Ohio State, this is a part of our mandate as a land grant institution to be of service in our community. Our President Johnson, spoke with us very directly on yesterday in her address to the university community to challenge us to live up to our expectations in the community. William, your organization offers our students an opportunity to do that, because I want to see our students running for state government offices and local government offices, and participating in city council and parish councils and all of that wonderful work. And also to be a supporter of the arts and a participant in the arts community. So I thank you all for giving us a pathway to think about how we as everyday citizens act in this moment of COVID, and how we can imagine ourselves as engaged going forward. Thank you so much for this conversation, and encourage everyone to join these subsequent webinars for the Center for Ethics and Human Values here at The Ohio State University. Have a wonderful afternoon and happy Friday.
Thank you, Wendy.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Wendy.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
David.
Thank you all so
Great
much.
to be with you.
You too.
I've got Tina Turner in my head now, and it's your fault.
There's nothing worse. Nothing worse. That's the best voice to have in your mind for the rest of the day.